Montana, 1888. There is a kind of arithmetic that governs a man's life, a simple tally of seasons passed and winters survived. But there is another accounting, one of the heart, that cannot be measured in years. It measures only in before and after. For Silas Blackwood, the after had begun 5 years ago, the day he had buried his Martha. After that, the arithmetic was all that was left. He was 48 years old. He owned 600 acres of good grazing land. He had 140 head of cattle, a sturdy house he had built with his own hands, and a dog named Blue. These were the facts. They were solid and dependable, and they were all he had allowed himself to need. The world had shrunk to the boundaries of his fence line, to the familiar weight of an axe in his hands, to the lonely ritual of making coffee for one in the quiet before dawn. His life was a series of repeating actions, a litany of chores that kept the silence at bay. He rose before the sun, the floorboards cold beneath his bare feet. He would stir the embers in the stove, add a log, and set the coffee pot on to boil. While it brewed, he would stand on the porch, Blue leaning his heavy head against his leg, and watch the sky lighten over the eastern peaks. It was a vast and indifferent beauty, the same beauty that had swallowed his wife's last breath, and he met it each day with a stony resignation. He had stopped expecting it to offer him comfort. He had stopped expecting anything at all. The house was too large for one man. Martha's presence was an echo in the rooms, a ghost in the shape of the armchair she had favored, in the worn spot on the kitchen floor where she used to stand. He kept her things, not out of sentiment, but because the effort of removing them felt greater than the effort of living with their ghosts. Her sewing basket still sat by the hearth, a piece of mending still folded neatly on top. He never touched it. It was a monument to a life that was over. His life. His work was his only communion. He mended fences with a meticulous precision, his hands moving with an economy born of long practice. He rode his land, knowing every dip and rise, every rocky outcrop where a calf might get lost. He was a good rancher, respected by his neighbors for his diligence and his fairness. They knew his story, of course. In a place like this, everyone knew everything. They saw the deep quiet that had settled on him, and they gave him his space, offering nods in town and leaving him to his solitude. They understood grief as they understood drought or blizzard. It was a natural hardship to be endured. He talked more to his dog and his horse than he did to any person. Blue understood the language of his silences. A heavy sigh was a signal to rest a chin on his knee. The sharp set of his jaw meant a long, hard day ahead. The dog was a warm, living presence in the cold arithmetic of his days, a single, uncalculated variable of affection he still permitted. One afternoon in late spring, while checking the fence line that bordered the old McGregor place, he saw something new. The McGregor ranch had lain fallow for a year since old Angus passed, a sad patch of neglect marring the landscape. But now there was movement. A figure, small in the distance, was wrestling with a collapsed section of fence. He reined in his horse, watching from the rise. It was a woman. She was working with a furious, clumsy energy, trying to haul a fallen post back into place. She was losing the fight. The post was heavy, the wire tangled. He watched her stop, put her hands on her hips, and stare at the mess with a look of pure frustration he could feel, even from 100 yards away. Most men would have ridden on, minding their own business. The Silas of 5 years ago would have, but the quiet observer in him was piqued. He saw the stubborn set of her shoulders, the refusal to quit. It was a quality the land demanded, and it was rare to see it in someone so obviously new to it. He nudged his horse forward, the hooves making soft thuds in the damp earth. As he got closer, he could see she was young, younger than he'd thought, maybe not yet 30. She had dark hair pulled back in a messy knot and a smudge of dirt on her cheek. She wore a man's work shirt and canvas trousers, ill-fitting but practical. When she heard his approach, she turned and he saw her eyes. They were a clear, startling gray, and they held no fear, only a weary annoyance. "That post has seen better days," he said. His voice was rough from disuse. She wiped a strand of hair from her face with the back of a dirty glove. "It's seen better days, hours, and minutes. I think it died of old age about an hour ago." He dismounted, Blue trotting to his side and giving the woman a curious sniff. She reached down and scratched the dog behind the ears without hesitation. Blue's tail gave a tentative thump. "You're new," Silas stated. It wasn't a question. "Ilara Vance. Angus McGregor was my great-uncle." She offered a hand, then seemed to remember it was covered in dirt and grime and let it drop. "I inherited this place." "Silas Blackwood," he said, nodding toward his own land. "Your neighbor." He looked at the fence. "You need a post-hole digger for that, and a new post. That one's rotted through." "I'm discovering the list of things I need is longer than the list of things I have," she said with a wry, tired smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "But I've got stubbornness in spades." He saw it was true. He saw the blisters forming on her hands. He saw the exhaustion etched around her eyes, but underneath it, a core of solid steel. It was the same steel he had seen in Martha when they were first starting out. That refusal to be beaten by a piece of land or a piece of bad luck. The thought was a surprise, a flicker of warmth in a cold room. He didn't offer to do the work for her. That would have been an insult to the pride he saw so clearly in her. Instead, he walked to his horse, unstrapped a small tool roll from his saddle, and pulled out a length of good, sturdy wire. "This will hold it for now," he said, handing it to her. "Better than that rusted stuff. I have a spare post and a digger back at my barn. You can borrow them tomorrow, if you like." She looked at the wire in her hand, then back at him. Her gray eyes assessed him, direct and clear. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood." "Silas," he corrected her gruffly. "Silas," she repeated. "I'm Ilara." He simply nodded, mounted his horse, and rode away, Blue trotting faithfully behind. He did not look back, but he was aware of her watching him go. The encounter was a small stone dropped into the still pool of his life, and the ripples spread further than he could have imagined. He had done a simple, neighborly thing. He did not have to. He did not have to do anything, but he had. Over the following weeks, Silas found himself watching the McGregor place. He told himself it was just curiosity, a rancher's natural interest in the goings-on of his neighbor. But it was more than that. He watched Ilara Vance learn her land. He saw her from a distance, a small, determined figure moving against the vast backdrop of the mountains. He saw her up at dawn, struggling to milk the two scrawny cows Angus had left behind. He saw her mending the roof of the small cabin, perched precariously on a ladder. He saw her fail. He saw a calf get through a weak spot in her fence and spend half a day chasing it back. He saw her try to plow a small garden patch with a broken-down hand plow, the work slow and back-breaking, but he never saw her give up. Each time she was knocked down, she got back up, her movements a little surer, her shoulders a little straighter. She was learning, she was adapting, she was surviving. A quiet, unspoken routine began between them. One morning she found a solid, well-oiled post-hole digger and a seasoned cedar post leaning against her fence. There was no note. She knew where it came from. A few days later, he found a jar of chokecherry jam on his own porch step, a small, neatly tied piece of calico covering the lid. He opened it, and the sharp, sweet smell reminded him of Martha's kitchen. He put the jar away in the pantry, but he found himself thinking about it all day. He started making a little extra coffee in the morning. He didn't know why. The habit just started. He would pour the second cup into a tin mug and leave it on the porch railing while he did his morning chores. It was always cold by the time he came back, and he would pour it out on the ground. Still, he kept doing it. It was a foolish, sentimental gesture, and he chided himself for it. But the habit stuck. It was an acknowledgement of a presence, a crack in the wall of his solitude. A trip to town for supplies became a source of unwelcome information. He was at Henderson's general store, loading sacks of grain into his wagon, when the proprietor came out, wiping his hands on his apron. "Morning, Silas," Henderson said, squinting at the sky. "Looks like we might get some weather later." "Seems so," Silas replied, not one for idle chatter. "Heard you've got a new neighbor," Henderson pressed, his eyes full of the friendly curiosity that served as the town's newspaper. "That McGregor girl. Quite the thing. A woman trying to run a place like that on her own." Silas just grunted, heaving another sack. "Bo Maverick's been over there a few times," Henderson continued, undeterred. Bo was a prosperous rancher from the next valley over, a man known for his smooth talk and his sharp eye for acquiring land. "Telling folks he's just being neighborly, but we all know Bo. He smells an opportunity. A young woman, alone. He probably figures he can either buy her out cheap or marry his way into the property." Silas stopped, the sack of grain held halfway to the wagon. An unfamiliar feeling tightened in his chest. It was a cold, hard knot of anger. He thought of Bo's easy smile and predatory eyes. He thought of Alara with her dirt-smudged cheek and her blistered hands fighting for every inch. The image of Bo Maverick circling her like a coyote was deeply unsettling. "She's a hard worker," Silas said, his voice low. He tossed the sack into the wagon with more force than was necessary. Henderson raised his eyebrows, surprised by the defensive tone. "Oh, I don't doubt it. Just saying. It's a tough road for her." A tough road. The conversation stayed with Silas all the way home. The anger simmered. It was illogical. It was not his concern. Ilara Vance was a grown woman, capable of making her own decisions. But the thought of Bo Maverick preying on her vulnerability felt like a personal offense. He was counting the arithmetic, just as Henderson was. A woman alone, a failing ranch. It added up to an easy target. Silas found himself wanting to change the equation. "What country are you listening from today? Go ahead and drop it in the comments below. It means the world to know where this voice is reaching, to know that these stories are finding a home all across the globe. Thank you for that." Now, let's get back to the story, because Silas is about to discover that some things, like an approaching storm, force you to act whether you think you're ready or not. The weather turned, just as Henderson had predicted. The sky, which had been a clear, high blue that morning, began to curdle with gray clouds that rolled in from the northwest. The air grew heavy and still, carrying the metallic scent of imminent rain. Silas felt it in his bones, the way he always did. This wasn't just a spring shower. There was a cold, mean edge to the wind that was kicking up, a promise of something worse. He worked with a grim efficiency, his movements sure and swift. He checked the barn, securing the doors. He drove his small herd of horses into the main corral where they'd be sheltered. He then began the slow work of pushing his cattle down from the high pastures into the more protected lower valley. The wind was whipping now, tearing at his hat, and the first icy drops of rain began to fall. Blue stuck close to his horse's heels, his head down, his tail tucked. As he worked, his eyes kept straying to the east, toward Alara's property. Her land was more exposed than his. Her small herd scattered across an open plain. Her barn, he knew from a distance, was a dilapidated structure that wouldn't stand up to a real gale. He saw her out there, a tiny figure on horseback, fighting to gather her animals. She was trying to push them toward her barn, but the cattle were spooked by the storm. Their heads turned away from the driving wind, refusing to cooperate. She was losing the battle. He finished with his own herd, latching the final gate. He was done. He was safe. He could go inside, build up the fire, and ride out the storm in the solid comfort of his house. It was the sensible thing to do. Her cattle were not his responsibility. The arithmetic was clear, his safety versus her struggle. He hesitated for only a moment. He looked at the darkening sky, a bruised and violent canvas. He looked at the lone figure of Alara, her horse fighting the wind, her efforts looking more and more futile. He thought of Beau Maverick and his predatory calculations. He thought of the jar of jam on his pantry shelf. He did not have to. He spurred his horse, turning not toward his own warm house, but toward the fence line, toward her. The rain was coming down in sheets now, cold and relentless. It quickly turned to sleet, stinging his face like tiny needles. The wind howled, a physical force that seemed to want to strip the world down to its bones. He rode hard, Blue struggling to keep up. He reached her as she was making another desperate pass at a stubborn group of heifers. Her face was pale, her hair plastered to her skin. She looked exhausted and on the verge of tears, but her jaw was set in that familiar stubborn line. She saw him, and her eyes widened in surprise. "Silas, what are you doing? Your own stock." "They're secure," he yelled over the roar of the wind. "Your barn won't hold. We need to get them into the coulee on my land. It's sheltered there." She looked from him to the cattle, then to the flimsy barn. She knew he was right. There was no argument, no time for pride. She just nodded, her face grim with understanding. What followed was a brutal elemental fight against the storm. Together, they worked as a team. Silas, with his years of experience, knew how to read the herd, how to use the wind to their advantage. He rode the flanks, his voice a low, commanding rumble that seemed to cut through the gale, while Alara pushed from behind. They were a study in contrasts, his weathered calm and her fierce tenacity. They moved in a silent, intuitive rhythm, two people bound by a single, desperate purpose. It was slow, punishing work. The cattle, terrified, fought them every step of the way. The sleet turned to snow, thick and wet, blanketing the world in a blinding white. They were soaked to the bone, their hands numb with cold. Silas felt a cold he hadn't felt in years, a deep chill that went past the skin and into the marrow. But beside him, Alara rode on, her small frame unbowed, her face a mask of concentration. He saw her horse slip on a patch of icy ground, and his heart leaped into his throat, but she righted the animal with a skill that impressed him. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they pushed the last of her herd into the deep, narrow coulee on his property. The high, rocky walls offered a natural windbreak, and the animals huddled together, their backs to the storm. The work was done. They sat on their horses for a moment, shoulders slumped, heads bowed against the wind, the snow swirling around them. They were utterly spent. "My cabin is closer," she shouted, her voice thin against the wind. He just nodded. He didn't have the strength to argue or to make the longer ride back to his own house. They nudged their tired horses toward her small cabin, two ghostly figures moving through the maelstrom. Inside, the cabin was small and cold. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a few sullen embers. The wind rattled the window panes and screamed through the eaves. It felt less like a shelter and more like a tiny, fragile boat in a raging sea. They unsaddled the horses and put them in her small, leaky barn, giving them what little feed she had. When they finally stumbled back inside, shaking with cold, they stood dripping on the rough-hewn floorboards. The silence inside was profound, broken only by the storm's fury and the sound of their own ragged breathing. Silas had never felt so tired, so empty. Ilara moved first, her movements stiff. She knelt at the hearth and began to coax the embers back to life, adding kindling with trembling hands. Silas watched her, his mind a blank slate of cold and exhaustion. He felt a profound sense of dislocation, standing in this stranger's home, his world reduced to this one small, cold room. She got the fire going, and a weak, flickering light pushed back the gloom. She stood up and turned to him. Her face was smudged with soot, her clothes were soaked, and her hair was a tangled mess. But in the firelight, her gray eyes were luminous. They held a depth of emotion he couldn't begin to fathom. Gratitude, exhaustion, and something else, something raw and vulnerable. He knew he should go. He should thank her for the shelter, mount his horse, and face the storm for the last stretch home. It was the proper thing to do. He had helped a neighbor. The transaction was complete. He took a half step toward the door. "Silas," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He stopped. She crossed the small space between them. She looked up at him, and he saw the tremor in her chin she was trying so hard to control. She had been strong and capable all day, but the storm wasn't just outside. It was inside, too. The fear, the loneliness, the overwhelming weight of it all. She reached out and took his hand. Her fingers were ice cold, but her grip was surprisingly strong. It was not a gesture of romance. It was the grip of someone reaching for an anchor in a flood. "Don't leave me tonight," she said. The words hung in the air between them, simple and direct and devastatingly honest. It was not a proposition. It was a plea against the screaming wind, against the crushing loneliness, against the fear of facing the darkness alone. He looked down at their joined hands. He looked at her face, stripped bare of all pretense by the storm, and in that moment, the careful arithmetic of his life, the solitude, the grief, the years he had stacked up like bricks in a wall around his heart, crumbled into dust. "I won't," he said, and his own voice sounded strange to him, like a promise he had forgotten how to make. The storm raged all night, but inside the small cabin, a fragile peace settled. Ilara found some old blankets, stiff but dry, and they huddled on opposite sides of the hearth, close to the growing warmth of the fire. She made a pot of thin coffee, and they drank it in silence from chipped enamel mugs. There were no words to say. The storm said everything for them. It spoke of vulnerability, of the raw need for human connection in the face of an indifferent universe. Silas did not sleep. He sat and watched the fire, listening to the wind. He felt the warmth seep slowly back into his body, but it was more than just physical. For the first time in 5 years, he was not alone in the dark. The presence of the woman sleeping a few feet away, wrapped in a blanket, was a quiet anchor. He had come here to save her cattle, but as he sat in the flickering light, he wondered who was truly being saved. Morning came with a sudden, shocking silence. The wind had died. Silas rose and went to the window. The world was transformed, buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white. The sun was rising, casting a pink and golden glow on the snow, making it sparkle as if strewn with diamonds. The devastation of the storm had been replaced by a serene, unearthly beauty. He heard a stirring behind him and turned. Ilara was awake, pushing her tangled hair from her face. She looked at him, and in the clear morning light, a new awareness passed between them. The desperation of the night was gone, replaced by a quiet, uncertain intimacy. They were two people who had weathered a storm together, and that fact had changed the space between them. "The coffee's cold," she said, her voice husky with sleep. "I can make more," he offered. While she rekindled the fire, he went to the water bucket. The simple domestic act felt both strange and deeply familiar. He worked the pump outside, the handle squeaking in the frozen air. He filled the pot and brought it inside, setting it on the hook over the fire. They moved around each other in the small space with an unspoken grace, as if they had been doing this for years. As the coffee heated, the reality of his situation began to settle upon him. He was in her house. He had spent the night. He looked at her, really looked at her, not as a struggling neighbor, but as a woman. He saw the strength in the line of her jaw, the intelligence in her clear eyes, the capable way her hands moved as she sliced a piece of bread, and the arithmetic began its cold, relentless tally in his head. He was nearly 50 years old. She was not yet 30. He was a widower, a man whose life was set in its ways, a man whose heart was a closed and shuttered house. She was at the beginning of her life, a life that deserved more than the company of a quiet, grieving man. It was not sensible. It was not right. The town would talk. Beau Maverick would sneer. He was too old for her, too settled in his sadness. He had to leave. He had to restore the proper distance between them, to put the fence back up, figuratively and literally. He would drink his coffee, thank her, and go back to his own life, back to his solitude. It was the only decent thing to do. She handed him a mug of coffee. Their fingers brushed. The small accidental contact sent a jolt through him, a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire or the coffee. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice soft but her gaze direct. "For everything. For the cattle. For staying. Any neighbor would have done the same," he mumbled, looking down into his cup. "Beau Maverick is my neighbor," she said, a faint, ironic smile touching her lips. "He came by last week. He didn't offer to help fix my fence. He offered to buy my land. He said it was too much for a woman to handle alone." Silas looked up, his eyes meeting hers. He saw no self-pity in her expression, only a statement of fact. She was not asking for his help or his pity. She was simply showing him the equation as others saw it. She was showing him the cold arithmetic she was up against. Section, "But you brought wire and a post hole digger," she continued, her voice even. "You didn't tell me I couldn't do it. You just gave me the tools to do it myself. And last night, you didn't try to take over. We worked together." He listened, and the relentless ticking of the arithmetic in his head began to slow. She wasn't talking about age or propriety. She was talking about something else. She was talking about respect. She was talking about partnership. She was counting differently. She was not measuring the years between them, but the character within them. She was measuring value, not numbers. He looked around the small spare cabin. It was a testament to her struggle and her resilience. He looked at her, at the quiet strength that radiated from her. He thought of his own house, large and empty and silent. He thought of the second cup of coffee he poured out every morning. He realized, with a clarity that was as bright and sharp as the snow-covered world outside, that he did not want to go home. He did not want to go back to the silence. He had spent 5 years honoring the dead, and in doing so, he had forgotten how to live. This woman, with her stubbornness and her quiet competence, made him feel alive. The feeling was terrifying, and it was wonderful. The decision was not a lightning bolt. It was a quiet sunrise. It was the simple, profound realization that the wall he had built around his heart was not a fortress, but a prison, and he was tired of being its only inmate. He made the choice not to be practical. He made the choice not to be sensible. He made the choice to stay for another cup of coffee. He did not leave that day. He helped her dig out from the snow, check on the cattle, and repair the damage the storm had done to her barn. They worked side by side, the silence between them now comfortable, companionable. In the evening, he went back to his own house to tend to his stock, but he promised to return the next day. And he did. The weeks that followed settled into a new rhythm. The fence between their properties became a meaningless line on the landscape. They worked together, sharing the burdens of the two ranches. He brought his knowledge and his strength. She brought her relentless optimism and a fresh perspective. He taught her how to properly stretch wire. She showed him how to graft a branch from his one productive apple tree onto the barren ones by her cabin. They talked. He found himself telling her about Martha, not with the sharp pain of fresh grief, but with a gentle nostalgia. He told her about the dreams they had for the land, and she, in turn, told him about her life before Montana, a life in a crowded eastern city, working as a seamstress, always dreaming of open spaces. They were two lonely people who, in the shared work of survival, were building something new. One evening in late summer, they were sitting on his porch, watching the sun set behind the mountains. The air was warm, filled with the scent of pine and dry grass. Blue was asleep at his feet. The silence was easy, a soft blanket over the end of a long day. Silas looked at her. Her face was tan from the sun, her hands calloused and strong. She looked at peace, at home. He knew with a certainty that settled deep in his soul that he did not want to face another winter without her. "Alara," he began, his voice quiet, "this fence between us, it doesn't make much sense anymore." She turned to look at him, her gray eyes soft in the twilight. "Running these two places as one," he continued, speaking the thought as it formed. "It would be more efficient, make more sense." He paused, the practical words feeling clumsy and inadequate for the truth he wanted to express. He took a breath. "We could run them as one, as husband and wife." He had said it. The words were out, plain and unadorned. He braced himself for her surprise, for her hesitation. She simply smiled, a slow, beautiful smile that lit up her whole face. "I was hoping you'd say that, Silas." There was no calculation in her voice, no surprise, just a calm, steady acceptance, a rightness. A week later, they rode into town together in his wagon. They went to the courthouse first to file the papers that would legally join their land and their lives. Then they walked over to Henderson's general store. Mr. Henderson was behind the counter, weighing out beans for another customer. He looked up when they entered, and a slow grin spread across his face. He looked from Silas to Alara at the quiet way they stood together, and he understood everything. "Silas, Miss Vance, or should I say, Mrs. Blackwood," he said, his tone warm and teasing. "Ilara is fine, Mr. Henderson," she said, her smile unwavering. Beau Maverick happened to be in the store that day, leaning against the far counter. He saw them, and the smug confidence on his face faltered, replaced by a flicker of disbelief, and then sour resentment. He gave Silas a tight, clipped nod of acknowledgement, and then turned away, his interest suddenly captured by a display of horse harnesses. The town, in that small, simple moment, had witnessed the outcome. The arithmetic of the heart had won. A year passed. The fence posts that had once separated the Blackwood Ranch from the McGregor place were gone, pulled up and used for firewood. The two herds grazed as one. Alara's small cabin was now used as a storage shed and a place for her to do her mending and leather work. She had moved into the main house with Silas, and the silence that had haunted its rooms for 5 long years was gone. It was replaced by the sound of her humming in the kitchen, by the low murmur of their conversations in the evening, by the simple, comforting noise of two people sharing a life. Martha's sewing basket was still by the hearth, but now Alara's was beside it. The house was no longer a monument to a past that was over. It was a home, alive and breathing with a future they were building together. One evening, they stood on the ridge overlooking the coulee where they had sheltered her cattle during the great storm. The sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. "It's hard to believe it was only a year ago," she said softly. leaning against him. He put his arm around her, pulling her close. He looked out over the land, his land, their land. The world was the same mountains, the same sky, the same vast and indifferent beauty. But he was not the same. He was a man who had learned to count differently. He had not expected this. He had not expected a second chance at happiness, a late season bloom in the autumn of his life, but the storm had come, and it had washed away the careful calculations of his grief, leaving behind a simple, undeniable truth. He loved this woman. He was home. You see, in the end, the story is not really about a storm. The storm was just the catalyst, the event that stripped away the unimportant and revealed what was true. It revealed the character of a woman who would not be broken and stirred the heart of a man who thought he was already dead. Silas was trapped by the arithmetic of grief. He counted the years since his wife's passing, the acres he owned, the cattle he tended. He measured his life in tangible, lonely facts. He thought his age, the 20 years that separated him from Alara, was an insurmountable number, a fact that made any hope impossible, even foolish. He believed that the rules of sense and practicality were the only rules left for him. But Alara, she wasn't using his math. She was counting differently. She didn't see an old man. She saw a good one. She didn't measure the years between them. She measured the value of his actions. He didn't offer to solve her problems for her. He gave her the tools to solve them herself. He didn't see her as a woman to be conquered or acquired, as Bo Maverick did. He saw her as an equal, a partner in the fight for survival. In the height of the storm, he didn't save himself. He rode toward her. That was the only number that mattered to her. This story is a reminder that the heart has its own logic, one that defies the cold calculations of age or station or what other people might think is sensible. It's about the profound courage it takes to step out of the shelter of a familiar sorrow and walk into the possibility of a new joy. It's about realizing that the most valuable things in life, character, kindness, resilience, love, cannot be tallied on a ledger. They can only be recognized and honored and built into a home. Thank you for your time and your attention. It is the most valuable thing you have to give, and the fact that you share it here is what keeps this channel and these stories alive. I am truly grateful for each and every one of you. Until next time, be well and be good to one another.